Okay, that's enough focus on gaze for now. We're going to turn our attention to face perception. So face perception, detection, recognition, and some theoretical perspectives behind this. What I want you to do is focus on the screen right now. Pay careful attention. That image that I presented to you there was very brief. If you were paying attention to the screen, you should have seen the face. And I hope most of you probably would have recognized the image. So this is Ed Sheeran, who briefly appeared there. And generally it takes us in the region of sort of 150 or 200 milliseconds to identify a face. Something that's done automatically and effortlessly. So again, depending on the location of where you oriented your SocCog during that moment, you should have been able to pick up that information regarding his facial expression as well. So you should have been able to pick up that he was smiling, that he had a kind of positive emotional state that was there. So a lot of information that you're getting in a very brief period. Now, when thinking about how we process faces, there are some important issues here. The first one is that we process the identity and expressions. So face perception is a highly developed visual skill that involves multiple neural regions for processing both fixed and changeable features of the face. Now this is important because the face will often change. So our expressions that we have are highly relevant to understanding the emotions that other people are feeling. But we also need to understand and be able to recognize people with features that are relatively stable, that don't change too much. We also process faces globally. So face perception involves global, configural, holistic processing rather than local, feature-oriented or piecemeal processes. So we're going to come on to this in a minute, but basically what it means is you process the entire thing together rather than scrutinizing or analyzing individual features of the mouth, the nose, the ears, etc. It's also the case that we categorize using single features. So when merely categorizing someone, we can extract information from a single salient feature indicating their race, gender, age. And this can often be achieved even if the face is not well observed. So we can use certain features very well to do very basic categorical processing of them. Okay, so what about how do we go about actually processing faces? So when we're perceiving someone's face and we're trying to recognize their identity and understand their emotional expressions, what are the kind of stages that we go through? And what I've presented on the slide here is something you should be slightly familiar with. So this is Bruce and Young's model of face perception, but a kind of version 2, a little bit more of a complicated or detailed description of face processing that you might be used to. So essentially, we go about encoding faces based on the perception of facial features. So we look at the structure and the configuration, and then this splits into, you can think of two different pathways or streams. And one pathway running along the bottom here is concerned with facial recognition, whereas the other is concerned with detecting changeable aspects of the face. So such as speech analysis, we might look at expression and gaze. And this is a purely cognitive model. So again, we're looking at sequential stages in a sort of theoretical model, but it does also match on remarkably well to the neural regions that have been implicated in facial processing. So some of the regions that you might see on here is the inferior occipital gyri is involved in these very kind of early perception of facial features. Then the superior temporal sulcus will do the changeable aspects of the faces, whereas the lateral fusiform gyrus, and if you're familiar with that, that's the fusiform face area that we refer to, tends to be more dedicated to these invariant aspects of the face. So the things that help us recognize the person and identify exactly who they are out of many different people that we know. These then break down into some further regions. So, for example, if you want to understand the emotional expression that somebody's making at a particular time, this would activate regions such as the amygdala. You've got the limbic system with the basal ganglia, the insula, whereas the lateral fusiform gyrus, this links with regions of the anterior temporal lobe. So effectively searching for the regions that are likely to store categorization and knowledge of individuals' names. So aspects of long-term memory, basically. And there's a lot of kind of interaction between these regions. So if you want to understand which regions of the brain are active for processing faces, one of the methods that you would need to use for this is known as a method of subtraction, where you can compare what regions of the brain are active when we're processing faces versus when we're doing a kind of similar task but just doesn't involve facial recognition. So what you might do is present to participants images of faces and ask them to categorize them or identify them, and then also present something that involves similar levels of visual processing but just not the face recognition. So you might present faces and then inanimate objects such as a toaster or a cafetiere. And if you do this kind of thing, then you'll see on the image here, these are the kind of regions that are more strongly activated for faces versus cafetiere and whatever other objects that they presented. So this fusiform face area that's indicated in the red, that really lights up for faces, but is much less activated for objects. And there's really kind of two competing or leading accounts of how face recognition evolved. These are known as the face-specific view and the expertise view. So for the face-specific view, this account claims that at least for upright faces, these are processed by brain mechanisms that are specialized and dedicated for processing faces. So you've got a dedicated region for recognizing and distinguishing faces, and this kind of has this sort of evolutionary plausibility to it. Whereas in contrast, the expertise hypothesis claims that faces are processed by mechanisms that, rather than being unique to faces, they're just engaged by fine-grained discrimination of the object of expertise. So it just happens to be the fact that we are experts in facial recognition. So the fusiform area, for those that ascribe to the expertise view, the fusiform area is not dedicated to face recognition, but rather is specialized for classification at subordinate levels. Faces are processed by mechanisms engaged by fine-grained discrimination of the object of expertise. So in other words, if you're a car collector, you should be using the same mechanisms when you're identifying or discriminating between different cars that you possess. The same way that we are experts at faces and we encounter them so often that we're very good at discriminating between different faces. So if we look at some of the evidence in support of the expertise view, this comes principally from researchers Isabelle Gauthier and Mike Tarr. And they've been doing lots of work in this area to argue that the fusiform face area is also activated when we're recognizing other non-facial objects. And a lot of their research used something known as greebles. So these are computer-generated creatures that differ by gender, family membership, and individual identity. So if you look at, this is basically a series of families of greebles that are indicated on the right-hand side of the image here. And these are designed so that they fall into several families defined by their body shape, and then they also have two different types of gender. So they call them, the different genders are plock and glip. And these are defined by whether their protuberances, so the bits that stick out, point up or point downwards. And And the idea here is that you give these to participants, and initially when you first kind of get this bunch of greebles, people are very poor at being able to recognize or identify that this greeble is from the Samar family, and it's the Plock sex. So it's very tricky at the start, but they give them these greebles over a long period of time and basically extensively train them until they can recognize. So after enough time, as soon as you see this one, you know this is from the Radok family, and it's a Plock. It's the sex of it. So what they're interested in is what regions, or is there any activity in the fusiform face area when they're doing this recognition task on things that they have a high degree of expertise over. And indeed, they find this evidence. They say that as the participants become experts at distinguishing different greebles, the activation of the fusiform face area increases. And this is it shows a kind of linear relationship that as their expertise gets better, the activation of the fusiform face area increases at the same rate, basically. And there's also evidence from looking at prosopagnosia patients, so those that have damage to this area that it's supposedly for faces, that some of these patients also have problems categorizing both faces and objects. So things that might require a degree of expertise or specialized subordinate discrimination abilities. Such as one example is just being able to categorize snowflakes. So if you're looking at the patterns of shapes and distinguishing between them, prosopagnosic patients are not very good at doing this. There was another famous case of a dairy farmer with prosopagnosia. So he was both unable to recognize familiar faces or to be able to distinguish between cows within his herd. So it seemed to be the case that there's kind of expertise there that he has of understanding that this cow has a particular identity, that this is kind of completely diminished or knocked out when they have damage to this fusiform face area. Now, from the face-specific perspective, there is other recent research that's argued that, in fact, there is this region that's uniquely devoted to face perception. And in reality, if you look at the performance of participants with the greebles, that this doesn't depend on the same functions or mechanisms involved in face recognition. So they had two individuals with acquired prosopagnosia. So sometimes you can get prosopagnosia from a specific lesion or damage. Other patients have developmental prosopagnosia. So over time, this occurs. And they find the performance of these individuals. They displayed normal greeble learning despite having severely impaired face performance. So the two patients who are known as Herschel and Florence, the fact that they can show normal greeble learning is pretty compelling evidence that the acquisition of expertise in the greeble task, or whatever is needed in this greeble task performance, doesn't seem to depend on the same mechanisms that are used for face perception. So again, you can have in this example here on the top right hand side the different greebles that they're asked to learn, and then these are an equally difficult selection of faces that they've been asked to learn. And the plots on the bottom look at, over time, how is their accuracy or their performance developing with the faces versus the greebles. This dark blue line here is the performance of the patient with facial prosopagnosia. So Herschel does very poorly on learning these faces. It doesn't improve over time. Whereas the average participant, so these are a range of control participants, all after about kind of 3 or 4 sessions, have managed to learn to a pretty high accuracy these faces. Similarly, control participants improve on the greebles. The key thing here is that Herschel's performance also goes up. So he's not 100% at recognizing and identifying each of these greebles, but he's pretty good. He's pretty effective. The same when you're asked a kind of verification task. So, for example, you might be presented a face and you're asked the question, is this drawn? Yes or no? You've got a 50-50 chance of getting it right. Control participants, very good at doing this. Herschel, very bad. Whereas the same task with the greebles, they show just about the kind of equivalent performance as a control participant. And you get probably even more striking effects. So again, just focus on the red line that's on here. Florence's performance for the faces is poor. It's good for the greebles. It's poor for the face verification. It's good and even better than the controls for the greeble verification. Now this might be, the fact that her performance is better on both of these might indicate that there's some extra cognitive strategy that she's learnt to adapt. So whether it's paying greater attention to specific things, better memorization techniques, whatever it is, to help her adapt in a social environment with dealing with prosopagnosia.